Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Phil Lawler. I am a senior fellow at the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture at Thomas More College in New Hampshire. I'm happy to welcome you here today because the college, Thomas More College, and the center, which I represent, is committed to Catholic schooling and to the reinvigoration of education, especially here in New England, where we're located. The college is supportive of educational choice, tries to help students and families with scholarships, with summer programs for interested students, of course, with special support for students in need. I hope you, if you are hearing about Thomas More College for the first time, will look into it. If you're hearing about our center for the first time, please check us out on the web. And if you are interested, join our mailing list and hear more about events like this one. If you look into the center, you'll see that we have several areas of special focus for our work. Two of them are education and the integrity of the Catholic faith. Those two subjects are keenly involved, neatly involved in our subject matter for today. The subject matter particularly is prompted by the book Vision of Hope, which was published by the Pioneer Institute in Boston. And we're grateful to the Pioneer Institute for publishing that book and for helping us to set up this event. In today's event, we plan to move, as somewhat the book does, from theory into practice. We begin with George Weigel talking about how education imbued in Catholic culture shaped the extraordinary vision of Pope St. John Paul II. Then Kara Kandel will speak about the findings of the Pioneer study. Grace Cotter-Reagan will speak on what is distinctive in Catholic education, why we need it. And Jason Bedrick take a practical approach on the political and economic needs of Catholic education, how we can support it and make it available to more people. We begin with an old friend, George Weigel. George is a distinguished senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and the author of many books, most recently Not Forgotten, which is sitting on my desk when I get home. Most relevant to today's discussion, he is the author of Witness to Hope, the remarkable biography of Pope John Paul II, and then, because the pontificate was so long and so historic, a sequel, The End and the Beginning. He's also the author of a foreword to the Vision of Hope, which brings us to our session today. George, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you and to be speaking with you. It seems 30 years ago we were on panels together, or was it 40? I don't want to think about it. On a very different topic.
It's good to be with you, Phil, and I'll hold up the audio visual here of the Vision of Hope. And I too want to thank the Pioneer Institute for undertaking this initiative. I'm very impressed by their work, and I hope this small book has the impact that it should have, particularly in Massachusetts, but indeed throughout the country.
Thank you. Your foreword, you speak about the educational experience of the young future Pope John Paul II in Poland. Was his vision shaped, the education that shaped his vision, what was distinctive about it? Was it a matter of intellectual rigor, or was there more to it than that?
I think it was a number of things, Phil. Despite decades of Polish jokes, Poland, in fact, in the early 20th century, had a very developed high culture. And when Poland regained its national independence in 1918, that led to the establishment of an educational system that was classical learning at its best. So from the first through the 12th grades in the provincial town of Wadowice, where he grew up, Karol Wojtyła, the boy and teenager who would later become Pope St. John Paul II, was immersed in liberal learning. Language, history, math and other sciences, Latin, Greek, expected of everybody. And then because this was Poland, that instruction in public schools was complemented by the catechetical work done by the local priests in those schools and in Polish parishes. So by the time this young man graduates from what we would call high school, what they still called gymnasium in those days, he probably knew a lot more than most men and women graduating from four-year colleges today. He was deeply immersed in language and literature. He knew the history of his country. He knew classical languages, and he knew his Catholic faith. And all of these worked together in him to produce a view of the human person, a Christian humanism, that he would develop throughout his entire life and continue to develop in his pontificate.
Tell us a little about his attitude towards education. He wrote a good deal and spoke a good deal about it during his pontificate.
John Paul II was a serious intellectual. He revered the life of the mind, both for its own sake and because he saw it as a reflection of that spark of divine creativity that is present in every human being. I think his reverence for education was intensified by the pressures under which Polish education tried to function between 1939 and 1978, when he left for Rome and became Pope. First, there was the Nazi occupation. The Nazis simply shut down Poland schools. They closed the universities. They closed most of the high schools. Young people were to be taught elementary skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but that was it, because the whole purpose of the occupation was to work the Poles to death for the greater glory of the Third Reich. The fact that many of young Wojtieła's professors at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow during the 1 year of normal undergraduate education he had, 1938 to 39. The fact that a number of those professors died in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp as part of the Nazi attempt to literally decapitate Polish culture left a deep impress on him. The fact that that university reconstituted itself as an underground institution and kept going when you attended classes or taught classes at the risk of your life under the Nazi occupation left a deep impression on him as well. And then, of course, after the Germans are driven out, the Soviets come in, and there's a whole different challenge, and that is the challenge of the attempt to turn education at all levels, elementary, secondary, and university, into an instrument of ideological indoctrination. And he had to learn how to resist that. And in his work as a young university chaplain, he had to learn how to help students resist that. So the fact that he had to fight for education, for real education, for genuine liberal education, I think deepened this reverence for learning within him. I'll also say that from our personal interactions over almost 15 years, I came to understand John Paul II as the most relentlessly curious man I had ever met. He, to the very end of his life, our last dinner together was 6 weeks before his final hospitalization. He always wanted to know what was going on. What are the new books that he ought to be reading? What were the new arguments he should be attentive to? And this was not just a quirk of personality. I think it was a reflection of his conviction that tuning into all that was tuning into the Holy Spirit at work in the world and was preparing him to be a better servant of the servants of God, as a papal title has it.
Just in the realm of speculation, what might have been different about his life if, say, the Soviet Empire had been successful in turning Polish schools into the propaganda machines?
Well, they were to a large extent between 1945 and the revolution of 1989. The difference, Phil, was that there was an antidote to that. And the antidote to that was the church and the catechetical work of the church in preparing young people for First Confession, First Holy Communion, for confirmation, preparing married couples for their weddings. All of this pastoral activity, pastoral educational activity, was an antidote to that propaganda. Now, the propaganda was so generally crude and stupid that it almost self-immolated. But I remember when I first went to Poland in 1991 and met one of the major priest supporters of the Solidarity movement. He said to me that, those young men you saw at the gates of the shipyard in Gdansk in August and September 1980, they were the young people we catechized in freezing church basements in the 1950s and 1960s. So there was a kind of parallel educational system going on, and that prevented the propaganda and the ideological indoctrination from being successful.
Let's jump forward. What lessons should we learn from this remarkable life and this remarkable educational system? What lessons should we learn that we can apply to American education, American Catholic education today?
First, that education is not indoctrination. The attempt to now turn the public schools into instruments of indoctrination, whether it's on gender theory or this completely malicious 1619 project of the New York Times, which rereads American history through a truly bizarre lens. This has got to be resisted. Education is about leading people out a ducere into the truth. And the truth is not propaganda. Secondly, I think Catholics need to understand, and actually the whole culture needs to understand, that an education that simply brackets and then puts aside the question of God, the larger questions of human purpose in life, is an inadequate education. It's an education without windows, doors, or skylights. So some way has to be found in our state schools to introduce students to the great religious traditions of the world. And our Catholic schools have to be creative, orthodox, dynamic in teaching students and leading students into an appreciation of Catholic faith in full. That will happen differently, obviously, at different grade levels. But if Catholic schools are simply going to be more disciplined versions of state schools, they're not going to do what they need to do. And I would say the third thing is that Catholic education has always privileged liberal learning, language, literature, history, civics, as we used to call it, even geography, if anyone remembers what geography was, and religious studies. philosophy, theology, and perhaps even in high school, but certainly at the university level. These are the humanities, and they're called humanities because they deepen our humanity. A test tube can't do that. A calculator can't do that. They can do all sorts of interesting and amazing things, but our humanity is enriched through the disciplines I just mentioned. Our humanity is enriched through culture, and schools should be transmitters of culture, not ideological indoctrination centers.
Do you anticipate any particular difficulties facing Catholic schools in the immediate future in America?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge financial problem that we've got to face. When I addressed the Pioneer Institute several years ago in Boston, I had a remarkable exposure to some students from the Cristo Rey School Network there, which I think is studied in the Vision of Hope book. That partnership between schools and local businesses to help at-risk kids both learn and acquire useful employment skills, that's a model that can be, I think, replicated in other ways and helps ease the financial problem. There is also going to be a huge challenge of resisting the kind of ideological indoctrination that the Biden administration apparently has in mind. This is particularly true with so-called gender theory, but there are all sorts of other manifestations of this. And parents are simply going to have to step up and push back against this. This is a form of abuse of the young, and it should be called out for what it is.
George Weigel, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your contribution to this book. It was good to talk to you again, and wish you well with your latest.
Thank you, Phil. Good to be with you, and congratulations again to the Pioneer Institute for the book and to Thomas More College, a fine institution that I've had the pleasure to visit several times for its leadership in recovering authentic Catholic education.
Thank you. Our second panelist will be coming online is Kara Kendall, who is a senior fellow at the Pioneer Institute, the Center for Educational Reform, a research assistant professor at Boston University's Department of Educational Leadership and Development, and for our purposes today, most relevantly, an editor of this new book, Vision of Hope. Kara, thank you for being with us and summarizing in a few minutes the major findings of this book and their implications.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. We really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm excited to be here. I'd like to, before getting into what the book is about, why it's pertinent now, and its findings, I'd like to frame this by saying, as you note, I was formerly a research assistant professor at Boston University, and I am a senior fellow at Pioneer Institute. And I came to this work, this book is a compilation of work that's been done by many different folks over the years and updated in some respects. But I came to this work really as a student of Catholic schools and what they do, meaning that I am not myself a product of Catholic education. And so this is really something that a project that to me is about highlighting the importance of Catholic schools for true educational opportunity for all students. And that's a lot of what I would like to hit on today. I'm going to share my screen in a moment to show you some of the findings of the book, but I think it's important, even though, as I said, this book has been in the works for a very long time, it's important now in that the pandemic has shone a light on a couple of things that we've known has been going on for a very long time. And the first is that, Catholic schools have been suffering declines in enrollment for various reasons. And simply put, this is not great for kids. This is especially not great for students, especially those in urban communities those who often access Catholic schools as the only form of school choice they really have. And those families that value schools, often these are families that can't afford to move to a different district, families that can't afford to pay the price of any other kind of private school tuition. And because Catholic schools have a mission that really says, we take all comers and we want to provide you with an excellent education. When schools located in communities such as these close, it's a real travesty. And the pandemic has only shown a light on this problem. It's shown a light on a couple things, but it's shown a light on this problem in that we've lost to both closures and consolidations more than 200 Catholic schools in this country. And in terms of closures, most of them have been in urban centers. So it's really tough stuff. Of course, the other thing the pandemic has shown a light on is exactly what I'm going to begin to talk to you about now, which is what Catholic schools do and what they are capable of. And the fact of the matter is that certainly in Massachusetts and in many places across this country, Catholic schools have remained open, available, and providing a high quality education to students where other schools have not. Many private schools have remained open, but Catholic schools chief among them. And they've done that safely, and they've done that with strict adherence to protocols that not only help families, working families who need their children to be in school, who want their children to be in school, but that also keep teachers safe in addition to keeping children safe. So I wanted to open with that. All of that said, the reason we should be valuing Catholic schools now and forever is not just because of the pandemic, it's because what they've provided over time. So I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit about, I'm hoping everybody can see my screen, and perhaps somebody will give me, maybe not, one moment, please, I'm sorry, an indication. You cannot. And I'm guessing not. So I think I'm having some Zoom difficulties here at the moment. But that's okay, I can talk through it. What we know about Catholic schools nationally and what we've known for some time is something called the Catholic schools effect. And that is simply put that Catholic schools, as I said, they welcome all comers, and they tend to produce very strong academic outcomes for all kids. So when we take students who perform one way when they're in their district schools and of the same socioeconomic background, the same social capital, relatively speaking, social and cultural capital, and they attend a Catholic school, the Catholic schools really helps those students achieve much better outcomes. And one of the questions of this book was, does that hold true for Massachusetts? What do we know about Catholic schools in Massachusetts? And we look at the results of norm-referenced examinations, especially in the Archdiocese of Boston. What we find is that the trend holds true there. So that Catholic schools in Boston, students who of the same background really outperform their counterparts in the Boston public schools. Now, several scholars, as I'm sure many of you know, have written extensively about why this might be and why Catholic schools tend to be very helpful in terms of academic outcomes, especially to lower income students and children of color. It has a lot to do with their cohesive mission, with a very rigorous curriculum, with the idea that all children can succeed and access a curriculum, and we're going to teach to a high standard and not to the middle. I think I would also point out that it has a lot to do with Catholic distinctiveness, right? This sense that kids and families can coalesce around that we are all here for a purpose. And that certainly has a lot to do with Catholic identity, and part of that identity being academic performance and putting your best out into the world. Now, these academic outcomes, of course, lead to very important life outcomes for kids. And although the book doesn't go into it directly, we have increasing amounts of evidence that kids who attend Catholic schools, who graduate from Catholic schools, go on to, not only graduate from high school, but graduate from college at higher rates, which obviously has great implications for how they can fare later in life in terms of the labor market and what they are able to do. So academics is one key component that we focus on in this book. And certainly Massachusetts Catholic schools are providing a model of excellence. I think it's important to note, and I'm sure my colleague Jason Bedrick, who's a contributor to this book, will talk a lot more about this when it is his turn to discuss. But it's important to note that Catholic schools as I mentioned, especially in urban centers, are often the only form of school choice that many families have. I would say that it is especially true in Massachusetts and in the Boston area. So while in Massachusetts we do have some forms of school choice, they are limited, right? So we do have, we have a METCO program, which is quite excellent, long waiting list. And that's a program that allows students who live in Boston and Springfield, for example, to get on a wait list to attend a higher performing suburban school. We, of course, have charter schools, something that I've written a lot about for Pioneer Institute. In the city of Boston, we have many excellent charter schools, again, very high wait lists. So, well, there's been concern over the years that that charter schools, for example, would provide undue competition for Catholic schools. I think that Catholic schools continue to distinguish themselves not only because of their academic performance, but because they offer, and I think George Weigel probably touched upon this a bit, something that no other school can, and that is Catholic identity. They can offer an education not only rooted in academic excellence, but rooted in strong Catholic identity. And one of the other things we discuss in the book is that the demographics of Catholic schools in Boston are also very interesting. In that, not only, as I've mentioned, that they serve students who many of whom can't afford the cost of tuition, which contributes to some of the financial problems we see in Catholic schools, because there is a commitment to attempting to serve all students, even if that comes at a great cost, and which is why many Catholic schools are often operating on a shoestring budget. But demographically speaking, Catholic schools also attract a lot of families that in fact are not Catholic. And so these are families that are attracted to these schools, not only for the very high quality of education, the very high quality of teaching, but also in anecdotally and in some qualitative research, we know families are attracted to these schools specifically because they offer an education rooted in faith, even if it's not the faith of the family, right? So they offer an education that's really rooted in something that families value, which is a specific discipline, a worldview, a way of teaching children how to think and how to behave in the world and how to care for one another. So I think that that's incredibly important. In addition, though, to this high academic performance and to this Catholic identity, and in the book we talk at length about encouraging Catholic schools, as I think as was just mentioned, to embrace their Catholic identity and to in fact be Catholic. If you feel like you are in a place where you are competing for students with the public schools because of declining enrollment, the way to do that is not to become more like the public schools. It's in fact to become more of who you are, is what we argue, because the indicators are that that's what families want. That said, that doesn't mean that Catholic schools shouldn't and aren't innovating to solve some of the problems that they've been experiencing over time. So the Cristo Rey model was just touched upon, and that is indeed something that we look into in the book. We profile the two Cristo Rey schools that are here in Massachusetts, one in Lawrence and one in Boston. And we talk specifically about this model, which is in fact a national a model. Cristo Rey schools exist across the nation. They started in Illinois. And what they do is they say, okay, well, we have this problem that we provide this quality of education to students. And in fact, it's not a very financially viable model to just say, we would like to serve students who can't afford the price of tuition, and so we're going to fundraise our way out of it. Cristo Rey is really unique and innovative in that the model says, we're going to take students, we are going to take students who can't afford to pay tuition at a run-of-the-mill private school. We're going to provide them with a very rigorous liberal arts education rooted in Catholic identity, and we're going to help fund this by also running a work-study program. And the work-study program is something that all children, all high schoolers, these are high schools, participate in. And it's fascinating because children are combining their education with being embedded in a place of work somewhere in the community that the school helps to facilitate, which is in so many ways, it's on-the-job training, but it's so much more. It is about schools being embedded in communities, communities being embedded in schools. We were talking about this a couple of days ago, and one of the things I shared that I noticed in my time studying Cristo Rey, and many years ago, I spent off and on over the course of 6 months. I think I spoke to almost every student at what is now Cristo Rey Boston at the time, and all teachers. And one of the things that was very, very clear to me is that this model taught kids how to walk in the world as adults in a way that I think most high schoolers just have no idea how to do. And I remember very distinctly, very clearly being pregnant with my first child at the time. So this was actually a very long time ago, well over a decade ago, and thinking to myself, what a blessing to see students with some sense of how to interact with adults, how to behave in a workplace. And to be clear, it doesn't always go well for students the first time around. That's something that the school helps students to understand over time. But really how to land in the world, because this equips students for so many things later in life that I think far too many of us, and I say this as a former college professor, don't even know how to do when we graduate from college. And these students are able to do it upon graduation from high school. And so, of course, the Cristo Rey model, it offers just so much in the way of not only this more sustainable, it's not to say it's without its challenges, but more sustainable financial model for the school itself, with this side benefit of offering students not only the high quality education rooted in classic liberal arts, but also the work study program. We profiled a couple of other innovations in Catholic schooling, including an attempt at vocational technical training here in Massachusetts. So we know that there are many very successful vocational technical programs in Massachusetts. In fact, some of the most competitive schools in this state are voc tech schools, and Catholic education Catholic schools are getting in on that game. And so there's a wonderful chapter that talks about the healing hand and schools that are preparing students for careers in the medical profession. And in fact, helping students to, in many cases, pay their way through college because they now have a skill that they've learned while in high school that they can take with them in life. That is, by the way, also very rooted in a Catholic identity, in this sense of community and how we help one another and what it means to be a caring and contributing member of our communities. And so all to say that I think that even during this time when we're seeing these declines in enrollment, many Catholic schools across Massachusetts are remaining rooted in exactly what they are, which is very Catholic schools offering this distinctive brand of education to students, while at the same time learning how to adapt and learning how to respond to the changing needs of families, and in fact, to a changing educational market, if I may use that word, because that's indeed what we're talking about. But at the end of the day, I think that what's most important for me as a parent and as I said, a student of Catholic education, is the way in which these innovative models respond to the desires, to the needs of parents and families, and at the end of the day, of students. And the fact that they do say, we believe that educational opportunity is for all, and we welcome all comers, and we are going to find a way to make Catholic education work for you and your family, if indeed that is what you want. So I'm just going to spend a couple more minutes to talk a little bit about some of the recommendations that come out of this book, beyond the few that I've already given, which include Catholic schools really maintaining their Catholic identity, Catholic schools remaining committed to academic excellence, Catholic schools continuing to adapt and innovate in some of the ways that I've highlighted. But then some of the final recommendations that we have are really for the state of Massachusetts. And I promise I won't steal Jason Bedrick's thunder, because he's written just an amazing chapter for us about some lessons that Massachusetts can learn and what it might look like indeed for us to adopt a program that would allow families to access not Catholic schools and other private schools through state-sponsored programs. And so just to say very briefly, there are a couple chapters here that talk about Massachusetts' very strict Blaine Amendment. There is a landmark 2020 Supreme Court case that has in fact struck down most Blaine amendments across the country. And Blaine amendments, I will say, are constitutional provisions that have prohibited, or at least did in more than 20 states, Jason will correct me as to the exact number, have for a long time prohibited public funding from going to private institutions, or in particular faith-based institutions. And the Supreme Court case Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue tells us that in the presence of a publicly provided program that allows students to use funds, whether it's a tax credit, monies raised through a tax credit program or some other mechanism, that if where those programs exist, they can't discriminate against schools or allowing children to access schools simply because those schools are faith-based. Now, Massachusetts' Blaine Amendment is particularly strong, so it remains to be seen. We don't think that Espinoza impacts it, although there are other cases pending. But one of the things we very strongly recommend is that Massachusetts consider helping families access increased educational opportunity through a tax credit scholarship program. These are programs that are designed to use private funding, so donations. Taxpayers receive a credit in exchange for a donation to what we often refer to as a scholarship granting organization. We have many scholarship granting organizations already here in the Northeast. And those scholarship granting organizations can help students access schools of choice. If more students had access to such programs, more of them would most certainly be choosing Catholic schools. I think that the past year has shown that to be true now more than ever. And it would put Catholic schools in a position where they would finally be able to probably charge something close to the real cost of tuition. That is the cost they bear, not the cost they charge, and help these schools to recover not only some of the enrollment that they've lost because parents can no longer afford to pay even any amount of tuition, but also operate in a way that allows them to offer everything they want to offer. We provide very strong recommendations that Massachusetts adopt such a program. And I think now the question is really, especially given what the last year has shown us, will the state find the will to act? Our neighbors around us, I will point specifically to New Hampshire, and I hope Jason discusses this more, are in many ways putting us to shame with the expanded educational opportunities that they offer students and families. And I think that the time for Massachusetts to act is certainly now. It's certainly now, and we hope that this book, A Vision of Hope, can be part of that, can be part of the impetus for parents to coalesce and for the state to really say it's time to enhance educational opportunity for all students and families in the Commonwealth. And with that, thank you, Phil. I will.
Thank you very much, Kara Kendall. Could I ask, just to draw what seems to me an obvious conclusion from what you were saying at the end, if such a program were adopted, wouldn't you anticipate that public school standards would also rise just because they would be at a competitive disadvantage if they failed to rise?
Yeah, well, in fact, I don't even have to anticipate that because we have evidence of that from other states. So I can point to Florida, which is a state with more choice, more educational options for families than any other in the Commonwealth, and than any other in the country. And certainly there is evidence that when that competitive pressure is a thing that absolutely causes all schools to rise to the occasion. So it's good for all kids.
Right. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for your role in putting out a very informative book.
Thank you.
We continue our event today with Grace Cotter-Regan, who is president of Boston Catholic High School, a Jesuit institution. She has had a career as a Jesuit volunteer in Belize, as executive director of advancement for the New England province of the Jesuits, as head of school of St. Mary's in Lynn, and then found her way back to Boston College High School, with which she's had a long association through her father. Thank you for joining us on short notice to speak about what you found about distinctive Catholic education.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm honored to be part of this panel, so thank you again for inviting me. I serve as the president of BC High, which is an all-male Jesuit Catholic school, grades 7 to 12. And prior to BC High, I was the head of school at St. Mary's in Lynn. And when I was in Lynn, I was introduced to the important work of the Pioneer Institute, and I'm grateful to be invited to speak on behalf of my colleagues in the Jesuit and Catholic Network. I am a product of Catholic education. My husbands and sons are also products of Catholic education. I attended a Catholic grammar school, high school, college, and grad school. I was educated by the Sisters of Divine Providence, the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, and the Jesuits. Each experience was grounded in faith and the charisms of the orders, and I've integrated the spirit of the Blessed Mother, St. Julie, and St. Ignatius in my life. When I think about Catholic education, there's something to be said for a faith tradition and the tenets of the various orders or missions. And I ask myself all the time, what differentiates us? Well, there's a holistic approach to the development of the student. For BC High, we ask our students to commit to becoming the grad at grad. And our brand promise to our parents is that your son will become the grad at grad. He will be open to growth, intellectually competent, religious, loving, and committed to justice. We commit to Cura Personalis, which is the care of the person, and we are aligned with over 1,000 global Jesuit schools and the official plan for Jesuit education, often abbreviated as Ratio Studiorum, which is the Latin plan for studies. And that was a document that standardized the global influential system of Jesuit education in 1599. So Jesuit education has been around for a long time under the leadership of St. Ignatius, our founder. As a professional, I always look to the national standards and benchmarks for Catholic education and the Jesuit guidelines in our ways of proceeding. Both documents provide guiding principles for leadership to make sure we are holding ourselves accountable to mission and operational vitality. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Our schools are committed to mission and our respective charisms, formation and faith formation are pillars for our faculty, staff, students, parents, and alumni. And I think this is important because the mission really permeates all of our constituent groups. And I'm really proud of the work that we do at BC High and of my colleagues around the Archdiocese and the Jesuit Network. From Standard 7 of the National Benchmarks for Catholic Education, an excellent Catholic school has a clearly articulated, rigorous curriculum aligned with relevant standards, 21st century skills, and gospel values implemented through effective instruction. And I think that's a wonderful way to look at how we look at our curriculum and our education. Catholic education is important, and I believe essential, especially today. To think about who will be leading this country 20 years from now, I think it's our moral imperative to produce a diverse and inclusive group of leaders whose moral compass will impact and shape our country and our individual communities. The national standards and benchmarks for effective Catholic elementary and secondary education is intended to describe how the most mission-driven, program effective, well-managed, and responsibly governed schools operate. And you can find that at www.catholicschoolstandards.org. And I'll put that in the chat at the end of my presentation. I always frame my institutional goals in the 4 guiding areas. I think about mission and Catholic identity, governance and leadership, academic excellence, and operational vitality. This document also contains 3 types of statements grounded in church teachings, best practice, and proven success of those committed to the future of Catholic elementary and secondary education in the United States. And the 3 areas are defining characteristics, the standards, and the benchmarks. I really encourage you to look at that if you're an educator. They're just great tools to hold you accountable, to help you do some mission work. It's helped me in my professional career as well as the ways of proceeding. To follow up with George's comments, the challenges we face as a country is a demographic decline in students, school choice with public and private, and many options with charter and independent schools. For Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of Boston, the financial and long-term sustainability of the schools is a great challenge. Access and affordability are what keeps most principals, presidents, and pastors up at night. I know that educators, particularly teachers, do not like to think about education as a business, but we are in the business of education, and sustainability is the name of the game in my estimation. So to advance our mission of Catholic education, there will need to be collaboration and innovative thinking. I've always believed that the mistake we make is not creating a brain trust of leaders and business minds to map out the short-term and long-term plan based on our true data sets. And we have great data. I'm a realist, and as a leader of a Jesuit Catholic high school, the lion's share of my time is spent on enrollment, fundraising, and financial management. I'm also the director of the work, and when you're missioned as a Jesuit leader in this role, you're considered the director of the work and considered the steward of the mission. So prior to COVID, the Archdiocese of Boston enrollment was perilously low, and COVID and the planning of the Catholic schools inspired 4,000 to 5,000 students to enroll through October 2021. To give you some context about the challenges we face, in 1942, there were 225 Catholic schools in Boston. By early last year, there were 100, and 10 closed during the pandemic. I often hear if we did a better job marketing our schools, that we would be in a better place or more successful. And I just believe marketing is just a tool. I believe that strategic vision and planning, along with the 10-year forecast, is the only way a school can survive and thrive. And now let me share some specific insights and data points from A Vision for Hope. Massachusetts and Boston Catholic schools outperformed Massachusetts national leading public schools on SAT and the Stanford 10. On SATs, Boston Catholic schools exceed national averages and dramatically outperform the Boston Public Schools, BPS. And while BPS's graduation rate is less than 80%, the Archdiocese of Boston schools have a 96% college matriculation rate. Catholic schools have a unique spiritual, moral, academic mission to nurture faith and prepare students to live lives filled by the Catholic worldview. This religious focus makes the standards, values neutral public school curriculum quite different from the work of Catholic schools. And that focus on catechism and lessons learned about character derived from classic literacy works from Shakespeare, Dante, Flannery O'Connor, etc. While the public schools are often focused, the recent education fads, Catholic schools draw upon the enduring works of history and literature from Western civilization. And as George said, we even have civics. The focus gives children grounding in their faith and the great truths about human nature that serves Catholic school students so well. George's foreword to the Pioneer book demonstrates how a grounding in classic literature, drama, and poetry was key to the understanding Pope St. John Paul II's vision of the hope in the face Nazi and Soviet control of Poland. Sorry, I'm stuttering. Ambassadors Flynn and Glendon intro the Pioneer book also helps make the linkage between the classical learning and the virtues of Catholic education. Catholic schools also provide moral and religious education and discipline. Those characteristics don't just appeal to Catholics. Fully 20% of students in the Archdiocese of Boston schools aren't Catholic. Catholic schools' achievement come despite far fewer resources. The average annual tuition at an archdiocesan school in Boston is $6,583, and most families receive financial aid. Although the schools rely on charitable donations to fill the gap between revenues and costs, overall spending is still well below average public school per pupil spending in Massachusetts, which is nearly $16,500, while the per pupil spending for BPS now exceeds $21,000. As Kara so eloquently pointed out, Massachusetts Catholic schools in Boston have worked hard to remain open during COVID-19, transitioning to higher quality remote learning when necessary, while understanding that there's no substitute for in-person learning and keeping our schools open as much as possible. We have been, as a group, collaborative, forward-thinking, while following COVID protocols. At BC High, we've had 3 cohorts named after our founder and his companions, Ignatius, Faber, and Claver. We have been innovative with our approach to COVID, to be nimble, but to seize the opportunity and grow and stretch with technology and innovation. I'm proud of my school, and I'm proud of our colleagues' schools and the collaborative spirit that we've worked with. We've really been committed to our students, and in-person learning is really important for our students. That's why the Boston Catholic schools have gained 4,400 students during COVID, while Massachusetts public schools have lost over 35,000 students. And for me, the gap just deepens, and it's really difficult to think about how these students are going to come back, and I'm really concerned about that. But the national enrollment trends in Catholic schooling remain difficult, which is why states like Massachusetts and elsewhere need to take advantage of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Espinoza versus Montana and establish and expand the private school choice programs as they have in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and 19 other states that now combine serve over 300,000 students in need, et cetera. So in closing, I just want to say thank you again. I'm a great believer in Catholic schools. I'm committed to mission-driven programs, and I'm delighted to be here and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just make an observation of my own as the product of a Boston Catholic high school, that this, I think, implicit in what you were saying, that I found as a freshman, my first day in the school, it was drilled into me unforgettably that this school was in pursuit of excellence. And that, as our English teacher put it, Excellence is the only standard up with which I will put. He never ended a sentence with a preposition. In this particular school, you'll be amused to know that the excellence often took the form of competition, which was healthy competition, and the highest we could aspire to in competition was to beat BC High, which might tell you which high school.
Yeah.
But I think, don't you think that that is also a part of the mission of the Catholic school is to bring out excellence and to instill in students the desire to be something more than they are?
Absolutely. When we talk about that at BC High, we always talk about the magis, which is the more, and we encourage our students to seek the magis in all that they do. And so for some of our students who come in who might be struggling or not scoring the way they did in elementary school, I think what happens is that, as you said, the competitiveness of our program helps, but also the support of the teachers and the many supports with our, student affairs staff, the campus ministry team. And I often say that our students often punch above their weight because they're aspirational, they want to do well. It's supportive. It's not, competitive to the point of, you're feeling like you're not worthy. We really try to hold our students up, hold their gifts up, help them when they don't achieve in a certain area or they get cut from a sport, ask them to think about something else and be open to growth, which is one of our grad pillars. So I think it's exciting to see students want to learn, but also to be around young men who are learning and love school and want to be successful. And success can take so many, so many directions, but I think that one of our alums, Jack Shields, talks about failure a lot. And he says, I don't like to think about failure. I like to think about it being iterative, and that it's the iterations that you iterate all the time and you get better. So never think of yourself as a failure. And I love that philosophy.
You learn, yes. Thank you very much. We do not have questions waiting for us. If there are questions from our live audience, please send them by email to center@thomasmorecollege.edu. That's center@thomasmorecollege.edu. We will do our best to answer whatever questions can come through. I don't know if it's technical difficulty or we're just, all of our speakers are so crystal clear that nobody has any questions. But thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Our final speaker this afternoon where we are, is Jason Bedrick, who is the Director of Policy for EdChoice. He has previously been a policy analyst in education for the Cato Institute and a member of the New Hampshire State Legislature, where he was active in the pursuit of educational choice alternatives, and educational policy research at the Josiah Bartlett Center, and a contributor, as you have heard, to the book Vision of Hope. Jason Bedrick.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate that the Thomas More College has put this event together to address this really crucial issue. And also thank you to the Pioneer Institute for inviting me to be a part of this fantastic project. I know Kara mentioned my name like 10 times, and I hope that I get around to addressing everything that she mentioned. I've been involved in the school choice movement for more than 2 decades, and so I want to get into some of the data that we have on school choice and really educational choice, since it's more than just private schools. I'm probably, I think, the only non-Catholic on the panel, although I am the product of a good Catholic education. And that's a part of why I got into the movement in the first place. I was very fortunate to be born to parents who could afford to live in a community in New Hampshire that had fantastic public schools, at least through 8th grade. Our town, Windham, was so small that at the time it did not have a high school, although it does now. And they could also afford to send me to a Catholic high school. And it seemed to me, when I got to college and was reflecting on my educational experience up until then, that the promise of equality of opportunity in the United States really cannot be achieved unless every child has access to a high quality education. But if we are assigning children to schools based on the home that their parents happen to be able to afford, you don't end up producing that kind of system. So I have a PowerPoint so that I can show you some of this data, and you don't have to stare at my furry face the whole time. So this is, I'm going to walk you through what the research says in a variety of different areas. So first, just there are 64 private school choice programs in 29 states, plus DC and Puerto Rico. You've got more than 1 million families participating all across the country. And we've seen tremendous growth just in the last decade. The modern school choice movement really started in the early 1990s. But as you can see from this graph, the growth in voucher programs, tax credit scholarship programs, and especially education savings accounts, which are the new kid on the block, really took off only within the last decade. Education savings accounts, I should note, we're talking here about K-12 ESAs, not college savings accounts. Unlike traditional vouchers with an ESA, you can pay for more than just private school. You can also pay for tutoring, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online learning, educational therapy, and you can roll over unused funds from year to year. I should note that New Hampshire right now is one of more than a dozen states that are considering adopting an education savings account. They're calling them education freedom accounts. There's also been a copious amount of research on participant test scores, educational attainment, civic values, the fiscal effects, racial integration, and all sorts of things. We're not going to cover all of these today, but I am going to go over a few different areas, starting with what I actually think is the most important, which is parental satisfaction. This was a survey that was conducted a number of years ago by the US Department of Education, which found that actually most families are happy with the school that they have chosen for their child, whether it's a charter school, district school that they were either assigned to or one that they chose through an open enrollment program, or private school. But we can see that private schools were the schools that had the highest level of satisfaction. We also have a number of surveys that look specifically at school choice programs all across the country. So there have been 30 that have examined school choice's impact on satisfaction. 28 of these 30 find positive outcomes. Only 2 found a negative outcome. And so you can see here, this is the first group. The vast majority, and these are all across the country, finding positive effects, in some cases finding some positive effects for some subgroups, some negative effects for some other subgroups, but still very high satisfaction overall. But just diving into it, here is in Arizona, this was the first year of Arizona's education savings account program. They called them empowerment scholarship accounts. At the time, all of the participants were students with special needs. And one of the questions that we asked was how satisfied they were with the education they were getting through the ESA, and how satisfied they were with their previous public school. And so you can see for this particular community, fewer than half were satisfied with their previous public school education. And unanimously, they said that they were satisfied with the education they could get through the ESA. When we broke it down based on income, we found that it was the lowest income quartile that was the least likely to express satisfaction, which, related to what I was saying earlier, makes a great deal of sense, because these are the families that are the most choice deprived. These are the families that can't afford either to pay for private school education or to purchase a home in a district that has high quality public schools. And yet when they were given access to an ESA, we see that it is this very same lowest income group that was the most likely to say that they were very satisfied. So again, they went from the least to the most satisfied. This is from a recent survey by Education Next talking about schooling during COVID. And again, we find that it's the private school families that were the least likely to express dissatisfaction and the most likely to express satisfaction with how their schools were handling COVID and what level of instruction and activities they were providing during this time. In all groups during COVID, whether it's charter, private, or district, the families expressed that they believed that there was some learning loss. But as you can see, the negative effect of COVID was far less among private schools than it was among charters or among district schools. And moving on to New Hampshire specifically. Now this is a pre-COVID era, but every single year, New Hampshire's tax credit scholarship program has a survey of all participating students. And you can see that when they ask about satisfaction, about 9 in 10 say that they are satisfied, whereas only about 1% say that they are dissatisfied. And we can see that this is affecting a population that otherwise would not have access to these options. 87% saying that without the scholarship, they would not be able to pay for private education. And when you ask the families about whether they believe their child has shown measurable improvement in academic achievement, again, it's about 90% that say that their children are learning more than they otherwise would. And so moving on to the data that we actually have, these parents' perceptions are actually, I think, based in something. So there have been studies all across the country of private school choice programs, 17 random assignment studies. Now, that's very important. You can't just look at the test score data of public school students and the test score data of private school students and then draw conclusions, because it's really an apples to oranges comparison. What you want to do is have a lottery. So just like in a medical trial where you're going to have a group of people with some certain condition that you're trying to treat, you're going to randomly divide them into two different groups. One group you're going to give the treatment, the other group you are going to give a placebo, and then you're going to measure the differences between these two groups. So in this case, you're going to have people that either applied for a voucher or a tax credit scholarship and randomly were selected to receive one, or randomly were not selected to receive one. And then you are going to compare the outcomes of these two groups. And we see that overwhelmingly, the results have been positive or neutral. Only a few studies, here you see in Milwaukee, there was some where some students, there was negative, some positive. And there were a few studies in Louisiana, which, as an aside, was the worst designed program in the country. Found negative outcomes, but for the vast majority, it has been neutral to positive among the random assignment studies. We've also looked at the effects on attainment, meaning the likelihood to graduate high school, enroll in college, or attain a college degree. And what we've seen is that there are 6 studies. 4 of them have found positive effects, and only a few did not find any effect. None of them have been negative. And actually, some of them have been quite positive. So, for example, this is from the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program. This is the largest school choice program in the country. More than 100,000 low-income students are participating in this program. And you can see that the boost in college goes up from 54% to 64%. You know, 10 percentage points, or about almost 20% increase in the number of or the percentage of students that are going to college. So this is a really, really strong outcomes. Now, one concern that you hear, though, is, okay, well, these programs may benefit the students who participate, but what about the students who are, quote unquote, left behind, right? Maybe it's the case that the best and brightest students whose families care the most about education, they're going to take advantage of these sorts of programs. And then that means that the public schools are going to be left with students from families that are less interested in education, who are on average harder to teach, and they're going to have less money to do it. And so you may be advantaging the few at the expense of the many. The data, however, just does not bear this narrative out. As a matter of fact, it's quite the opposite. So we've got research from a whole bunch of different states on this question, 27 separate studies looking at the competitive effects. 25 of these find positive effects. Only one found any negative effects, and that was one from Florida, but we have a whole bunch of other studies from Florida that actually have found positive effects. So it's likely that this is just simply an outlier. You can see it even goes on to the next page. That's how many studies there have been. As a matter of fact, looking at the Florida research, there have been researchers at the University of Florida doing a longitudinal study, and what they find is that the students who are entering the program, when compared to their demographic peers, are actually lower scoring. In other words, they're not engaging in quote unquote creaming. They're not, the private schools are not taking the best and the brightest, the ones who are the most academically gifted. The ones who are entering the program tend to be the students that are not doing well in their public school environment. And this isn't because, you know, these are the dumb kids or something like that. It's because for whatever reason, they're not the right fit for that environment. And so these students, it's the students who are doing well, the parents tend to keep them there. When the students are not doing well, those are the ones that have the greater incentive to leave and move into the private system, where the research has shown that they tend to thrive. And that after just a few years of participating in the program, they are operating not only at the national average, but well above their demographic peers. Finally, I want to look at civic values and practices, because one of the stories we often hear is that the public school system is, the public schools, sorry, 1 second. 1 second. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. We're doing Zoom from home these days. So again, civic values and practices. You often hear this story that the public schools are the cornerstone of democracy, and that the only way that we can really have a system of self-government is if we have a public school system where all children come together from all different religions and backgrounds and learn to be good American citizens. And the implication is that private schools can't do this. Private schools are, especially parochial schools, where they're teaching only one particular religion, one particular set of values, can't actually do this. But again, the data simply just does not bear out this story. So we have several studies that have looked at things like tolerance for the rights of others, civic knowledge, engaging in criminal activities, civic participation, volunteerism, social capital, civic skills, voter registration, voter turnout, and even patriotism. And overwhelmingly, the results show positive effects. So 11 studies find positive effects, 5 no visible effect, and none find any negative effects. Now, this is specifically looking at school choice programs, but there's actually an even broader literature that compares public and private. This is from a chapter in a recent book, School Choice Myths, which was, this chapter is written by Dr. Patrick J. Wolf of the University of Arkansas. And here you see that when it comes to civic values, most studies actually find an advantage for private schools. Very few find an advantage for public schools, and there's a fair number that find no difference between the two. When you narrow it down to just the most methodologically rigorous studies, you still have this massive private school advantage. Now, one of the areas that they look at is political tolerance, which, I mean, just look out the window today. This is something that our nation is desperately in need of. And we actually find that contrary to the narrative that you hear, it's the private schools that do a much better job at instilling this virtue of political tolerance. And when they're measuring political tolerance, the way it's usually done is that they ask the respondent to think of their least liked group. And they give usually a list, it might be the KKK or LGBTQ activists, or there's people on all, all different types of groups. And then you ask them, do you think that this type of person should be allowed to vote? Should they have freedom of speech? Should they be allowed to express their views on a television program? And so again, it's the private schools and especially the Catholic schools that do a much better job at instilling this virtue of political tolerance. There's also the question of civic knowledge and skills, right? I mean, do you know, can you name the branches of government? Those sorts of questions. Private schools tend, again, to do a much better job at instilling these. And also, we're living in the sort of bowling alone generation, or maybe playing video games alone generation. And so there's the question of voluntarism or social capital. Now, social capital is typically defined as having a close connection with one's community via social networks, group norms, and cooperation for mutual benefit. And again, overwhelmingly, we find is a private school advantage over the public schools. There's also been some recent research that looks at the effects of school choice programs on crime. So this is coming from the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. This is the oldest school choice program in the modern era. I say the modern era because there were a few that date back to the mid 1800s. But here you see just an overwhelming, a 53% reduction in the likelihood of being convicted of a drug-related crime. And we know how absolutely important it is for children's futures that they avoid interactions with a law like this. Likewise, an 86% reduction in the likelihood of being arrested for a property damage crime. And also, I'm sure our listeners are familiar with the success sequence that says that, first you should, get a degree and then get married and then have children. And so there's also been some research on teenage pregnancies or out of wedlock pregnancies. And what they find is a 38% reduction in the likelihood of being involved in a paternity suit. So just the overall, what the research finds is that school choice programs, or at least I should say educational choice programs, are much more likely to produce highly satisfied families, students that are better academically prepared, more likely to go on to college, and less likely to commit crimes, and more likely to be good, productive citizens. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm also happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Jason. What are the prospects for increased educational choice? Is it a state-by-state matter?
It is a state-by-state matter, but I will say this. Again, I've been involved in the movement for about 20 years, and I have never seen so many educational choice legislation going through state houses across the country than this year. The excitement and energy around the issue is as high as it's ever been. New Hampshire is very likely to pass an education freedom accounts bill. I know that there's been some talk in the media recently. Oh, it's HB 20 is dead because the committee voted to retain it. But there is also a Senate version that has the support of the Senate president and majority leader, the Speaker of the House, the majority leader in the House, the education committee chairs in both chambers, and the governor. And they are very committed to making sure that that bill passes. We're also seeing, West Virginia, Idaho, Iowa, Indiana, Oklahoma. I'm sure I'm missing a whole bunch of states that have already had bills pass at least one chamber. Florida and Arizona are both set to expand their existing programs. The prospects at the state level are really very, very good. But again, this is not something that we can just take for granted. Those people who are interested in expanding educational options, it's very important to get involved. You can go to our website, edchoice.org, learn all about the issue, contact your state legislators. They really need to hear from you, because those organizations that are dedicated to maintaining the status quo are very powerful, and they are organized. And so if they're not hearing from you, then your legislators are only hearing from them.
Right. And do you think that this new initiative, the energy behind these new initiatives, do you think that's coming as a result of the COVID shutdown, which is giving people a new perspective on schools, or is it a result of the Espinoza decision, or both?
I think it's more the former than the latter. I'm not sure how many people outside of the movement are as familiar with Espinoza. That obviously has been a huge boost to us in the movement. But for those not following Supreme Court precedent, which I think is describes most parents, I think it's really COVID. Now there's for a long time we've been doing polling on the issue, and it's usually pretty high. But I've never seen it as high as it is this year. There was one poll recently that had north of 85% of parents of school-age children support educational choice options. So I think it's a few things about COVID too. So one is just that the families recognize, what, we need different options. If my school is taking X approach, it may be that half the families in the school like that approach, but the other half maybe don't, because their risk tolerance is different, or they've got somebody in the home that's immunocompromised, or just working from home is impossible and we need the kids in school. Some kids are thriving in distance learning. Some kids, it's miserable for them. And so families are recognizing the importance of having a variety of different options. The other thing too is it's really been how the public school system has responded to COVID. Families believed that their local, neighborhood school was directly accountable to them. And it's been, I think, in many cases, a very rude awakening. You might have a majority of families that are clamoring for in-person instruction. But if the union says, no, we're going to stay closed, that school ends up staying closed. And so families are finding that actually the schools are accountable to other interests besides them. And then they see that their friends are sending their kids to the Catholic school down the street, and that school is still open, because private schools have to be accountable directly to the people who are paying them, which is the families directly. And so if a majority of families are saying, we want you open for in-person instruction, you've got to find a way to make it happen in obviously in a way that's safe. The private schools have a much greater incentive to do that, which is why that we've seen that the families are much more satisfied with private education and how private schools have handled the COVID pandemic.
Let me ask another question. We do not have a queue of questions, and I'm attributing that possibly to a technical problem, but you are speaking primarily about educational choice initiatives on the state level. And I wonder about the local level. I live in a small town in Massachusetts where the average price of educating in public schools is over $16,000 a year. When my wife and I moved into town with 7 children, that should have been a disaster for the public school budget, but it wasn't, because we homeschooled them all. Now, if that town had offered us some form of tax easement, it would have made it much more attractive to us to move into the town and buy a big house for which we would pay hefty real estate taxes. It's a win for the town. I brought this up with town officials and they all agree with me. But I have never heard of anything like that actually being done on a local municipal level.
Yeah, there are 3 states, New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont, that have something that are called town tuitioning programs. And in those states, it's really only for where the town does not have a school, or at least a school for certain grades. And in those cases, they allow the local dollars to flow, follow the child to a private school, either that the town contracts with, or in some cases, the families get to choose, and then the town cuts a check. But in most cases, no, it really is only at the state level. We would like, obviously, to see this happening at the local level as well. There was one bill in New Hampshire that was this year that was looking at that. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but one of the things they were doing was allowing the local districts to create their own education freedom account programs. So we certainly encourage that. I mean, we believe that the money should follow the child, whether that's from the state level or whether that's from the local level. But yes, it is the case right now, because it's a lot easier. It's really hard to do at the state level, and it's much harder to run that sort of campaign at the local level, all across the country. That is because you're dealing with 50 states, but you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of local communities. So we don't have any national effort on that, but certainly we'd support efforts to do that locally.
Well, I suppose as a practical matter, if you try to have an initiative on the local level, you would probably face organized opposition on the state level.
Yes.
The unions would be able to focus on a municipality, and it would be awfully tough to beat their authority, their power.
Certainly.
Jason Bedrick, thank you very much for your contribution, again, both to the book and to today's event. Thank all the panelists and all of the people who have joined us live, all the people who will be joining us later on the YouTube version. I hope you've enjoyed today's event. If you heard Jason Bedrick talking about the Espinoza decision and you haven't heard about it before, look on the website of the Center for the Restoration of Christian Culture, and you'll see more information about a previous webinar that we had on the Espinoza decision and its implications for school choice. Again, I'm Phil Lawler. I'm representing the center at Thomas More College, and I'm reminding you that our college, Thomas More College, is committed to the reinvigoration of education, particularly here in New England, where we're located. And our center particularly is interested in education, educational excellence, and in the integrity of the Catholic faith. I encourage you once again to look into both Thomas More College and the center. The center has a need for your support and a need for your interest as we continue to roll out our programs like this one. If you are a high school student, the parents of a high school student, or if you know a high school student, look into Thomas More College, the summer programs, and the possibility of enrolling here as your college choice, and a place where you will get, as George Weigel said, an authentic Catholic liberal arts education in the traditional mold. Thank you again for joining us. Goodbye.